Okay, so let's dive into this whole situation with the West. It feels like everything's changing so fast. I mean, remember all that energy at the Munich Security Conference back in 2022? Everyone was so pumped about taking on Russia.
Yeah, you could really feel that sense of, I don't know, like euphoria or exhilaration. Western leaders really seem to think they could just hit Russia with sanctions and force some kind of political change from within.
And now, just a few years later, that whole unified front has completely fallen apart. This year's Munich Security Conference was a total contrast. Especially with that speech from J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, it felt like he was dropping a bomb.
Oh, that speech was a bombshell for sure. Vance didn't hold back at all. He basically accused Europe of, abandoning all their core democratic values and turning into some kind of authoritarian regime. He even compared them to like the old Soviet apparatchiks. You can imagine how that went over.
Yeah, not well. But the thing that struck me is the irony of it all. Europe's complaining about the U.S. interfering in their business, but they seem to forget about all the times they meddled in places like Ukraine and Georgia.
Exactly. Vance even brought that up. He mentioned things like, the Maidan protests in Ukraine, where European leaders were practically cheering on those demonstrations that ended up toppling the government. And then there's what just happened in Romania, where they annulled the first round of the presidential election because of some vague accusations of Russian interference. It's pretty obvious they're trying to keep Gorgescu, the leading candidate, from running again. So yeah, I think it's fair to question Europe's commitment to democracy these days.
So it's clear that Europe is unhappy with how the U.S. is handling things. But what are they actually suggesting as an alternative?
Well, that's the thing. There isn't really a clear counter strategy coming from Europe. They're kind of stuck in this loop of sanctions and sending military aid to Ukraine, even though it's becoming more obvious that it's not working.
It's like they're just throwing good money after bad while the situation in Ukraine is getting worse by the day.
The reality on the ground is really grim. I mean, Ukraine is facing a really dire situation. NATO's resources are being drained at an alarming rate. And meanwhile, Russia seems to be getting stronger. Just look at the U.S., for example. They've sent something like 500 ATMS missiles to Ukraine, which is about a quarter of their entire stockpile. And they're running low on other crucial equipment, too, like the surface-to-air missiles, Bradley fighting vehicles, the Stryker armored personnel carriers, self-propelled howitzers. A lot of the stuff has already been destroyed in the fighting, and it's not like you can just magic up replacements.
So the West is basically pouring resources into a conflict they can't sustain, while Russia seems to be playing the long game. It's not just about weapons production either. They've been really smart with their military maneuvers, especially in those Kharkiv and Donbas regions.
Absolutely. You can see their strategic thinking in the recent advances they've made in those areas. And then you have Zelensky on the other side, practically begging for any kind of help he can get. He's been making these public pleas for more aid, more weapons, and especially for security guarantees from the U.S. There was even a report that he offered J.D. Vance access to Ukraine's mineral wealth in exchange for those guarantees during a meeting.
Wow. Did that work? Did the U.S. agree to give him any security guarantees?
Not a chance. The U.S. basically said, look, we're stretched them ourselves. We can't offer you any security guarantees. Zelensky left that meeting empty-handed and has been pretty vocal about his frustration ever since. He's even claiming that Ukraine was misled about the possibility of joining NATO.
Well, he's not wrong about being misled. They definitely dangled that NATO membership in front of him.
Oh, absolutely. People were pointing that out years ago, but I guess the promise of Western support was just too tempting. Now he's stuck with the broken promises while the military situation falls apart around him.
And that Russian advance just seems relentless. We're seeing reports that key Ukrainian strongholds, places like Kupiansk, Seversk, and Avdiivka, are at risk of being surrounded.
It's true. The Ukrainians are having a hard time launching any kind of effective counteroffensive, and it seems like their calls for help are falling on deaf ears.
Speaking of deaf ears, the British government is acting like they're living in a different reality. They're still holding on to this idea of Ukraine joining NATO, even though the U.S. has made it pretty clear that it's not going to happen. They keep saying Ukraine is on this irreversible course towards NATO, even after Trump and Putin had that phone call, and Pete Hegseth explicitly said NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table.
I know, it's bizarre. You'd think they would have gotten the message after that whole Kellogg incident, but they're still trying to act like they have some influence. Maybe they're just hoping against hope that they can somehow change U.S. policy.
Meanwhile, Trump seems to be taking a totally different approach. He's been talking directly to Putin, and there are rumors that he's considering easing some of the sanctions on Russia, especially the ones targeting energy.
Yeah, the word is that he wants to relax those energy sanctions to try and bring down global energy prices. It's a bold move, that's for sure, and I can tell you it's not going over well in Europe.
It's interesting, right? Everyone seems so focused on the idea that the Russian economy is going to collapse, but it doesn't seem to be playing out that way.
You're right. There were all these predictions of economic doom and gloom for Russia, but the reality is quite different. The Russian central bank has actually managed to keep inflation under control, and there are signs that their economy is starting to grow again. It looks like the West might have underestimated Russia's economic resilience.
So we're in this strange situation where the West is struggling to keep up its economic and military commitments, while Russia is weathering the storm and even making some gains.
It's a rapidly evolving situation, and the West's strategy seems to be floundering. They've got some tough decisions to make in the coming months. To really understand just how serious things are, we need to go beyond, all the political talk and look at what's actually happening on the ground militarily, like what's going on in places like Kharkiv, Sloviansk, and Pavlograd. It's interesting to see how things have changed in the conflict and what that tells us about each side's strategy.
Yeah, let's dive into that. What are some of the biggest military developments we've seen lately?
Well, in Kharkiv, the Russians are steadily moving forward. They've pretty much taken control of an important village called Spadakovo, or they're about to. It's a key spot because it's near the main route the Ukrainians use to get troops and supplies from Sumy to Sloviansk. Taking Spadakovo means the Russians are cutting off that vital supply line and putting huge pressure on Ukrainian forces in the area.
So it's not just about grabbing land, it's about strategically messing with Ukraine's ability to keep fighting.
Exactly. And what's really worrying is how fast and efficiently the Russians are doing all this. A lot of analysts were caught off guard by how quickly and decisively they're moving. It's almost like the beginning of the conflict back in 2022, but on a bigger scale and with, I think, even smarter planning.
It does feel like we're seeing 2022 all over again, but with even higher stakes. And Ukraine is in a much weaker spot now, having lost those key defensive positions and struggling to get new resources.
You're absolutely right. Things are looking pretty risky for Ukraine right now. But it's not just Kharkiv where the Russians are making progress. If we look west of the Oskol River, there's another concerning development. Russian forces have expanded their bridgehead there. They broke through Ukraine's second defense line, and they've advanced almost a kilometer. That's a big deal because it means they've managed to encircle a Ukrainian battle group and take control of some strategically important high ground.
So the Russians aren't just advancing, they're moving in a way that gives them a tactical edge. It sounds like Ukraine's defenses are crumbling under the pressure.
Yeah, based on what we're seeing, that's a fair assessment. And then there's Sloviansk, which has been a focal point of the conflict since the very beginning. The Russians have taken another village on the Zirabets River called Yambolivka. This move strengthens their position and puts them closer to potentially retaking Lyman, a town west of Sloviansk they briefly held in 2022.
So step by step, the Russians are tightening their grip around Sloviansk, and their advances further south, towards villages like Torska and Yampil, make it seem like they might be trying to surround the Ukrainian forces defending Seversk. Seversk is another really important stronghold for Ukraine, right?
Absolutely. And things are getting really tricky there. The fall of Bakhmut and Soledar already cut off key supply routes to Seversk from the south. And if the Russians keep pushing, the remaining routes from Sloviansk could be cut too. It's not a question of if Seversk falls to the Russians, but when. The Ukrainian troops there are running low on supplies and facing attacks from multiple sides.
Okay, so we've got Kharkiv, Sloviansk, Seversk, all looking pretty bad for Ukraine. But what about Pavlograd? There's been intense fighting there, too. What's the latest?
It's just as worrying around Pavlograd. Russians have been steadily pushing south of the city, taking villages near Vuhledar and blocking off important roads. They're also moving towards Melanivka, a village strategically located on the road between Pavlograd and Kosyantinivka.
So they're basically trying to do the same thing to Pavlograd, surround it, cut it off from reinforcements and supplies.
That seems to be their plan. If they take Melanivka and other nearby places like Novokonomishne, they'll be able to block the main supply routes into Pavlograd from the north.
Have the Ukrainians been able to counterattack at all and slow the Russians down?
They've tried, especially southwest of Pavlograd in areas like Pshane and Klishivka, but it hasn't really worked. They did briefly retake a small village called Zolota Hora, but the Russians will probably take it back soon. It's starting to feel like the Ukrainians are running out of options against an enemy that's stronger, has more resources, and a clearer idea of what they want to do.
And it's not just about land, right? The number of people dying in this conflict is huge.
You're absolutely right. Both sides have lost a lot of soldiers, but the Ukrainians are suffering the most. And all the while, the West's efforts seem to be fading. Their sanctions haven't crushed the Russian economy like they'd hoped, and they're reaching the limit of how much military help they can give.
So we have a situation where the West's strategy doesn't seem to be working, the Ukrainians are struggling to hold on, and the Russians are gaining ground. What could happen next? Where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, and there are no easy answers. Some experts think the U.S. might eventually push for some kind of negotiated settlement, even if it means accepting some compromises that people won't like. Others think the U.S. might slowly step back from the conflict and leave Europe to deal with the aftermath.
And what about Russia's goals? What are they ultimately trying to achieve?
That's a big debate. Some people say Russia just wants to secure its borders and stop Ukraine from joining NATO. Others think they have bigger plans, maybe even trying to regain the influence they had before.
It's a complicated situation with big consequences. But one thing's for sure, the war in Ukraine has completely changed the global landscape.
No doubt about it. We'll be feeling the effects of this conflict for years, maybe even decades. It's like we're watching the old world order, the one we've known since the Cold War, fall apart. The assumptions, the alliances, the balance of power, it's all changing right in front of us.
Like that end of history idea has been completely shattered. Remember when everyone thought liberal democracy was the winner and the rest of the world would just follow along?
Yeah, that whole idea of the West being triumphant. But the war in Ukraine has shown that story was wrong. It's shown the limits of Western power, how fragile their alliances are, and how arrogant their assumptions were. And you can sense the disappointment spreading. You see it in how European leaders are reacting. You hear it in what Western experts are saying. Even the way the media is reporting on the conflict has changed.
It's like they're all waking up to a new reality, a reality where their influence is fading and the old ways of doing things don't work anymore. And this brings us back to J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. It wasn't just criticizing Europe's policies, it was a direct challenge to their whole way of thinking.
Exactly. Vance was basically saying that the West's claim to be the good guys, the champions of democracy and freedom, just doesn't hold up anymore. And the funny thing is, by getting so defensive and not offering any real alternatives, the Europeans just proved Vance's point.
Their anger only highlighted the problems Vance was talking about. It's like they were accidentally proving him right while trying to say he was wrong.
You got it. And this leads to a crucial question. Where do we go from here? What's next in this whole story?
Well, it looks like the U.S. is rethinking its priorities. The Trump administration seems to be shifting away from Europe and focusing more on the Asia-Pacific region, where they see China as a bigger concern.
And that leaves Europe in a tough spot. What does this shift mean for the future of NATO and the whole transatlantic alliance?
That's the big mystery. Some people think NATO will become irrelevant, a relic of the past. Others think it will have to change, maybe focus more on regional security threats. But can NATO really function without the U.S., especially considering how weak Europe's military is?
That's a good question. European NATO members haven't been meeting their defense spending goals, and their militaries just aren't ready for a major conflict without a lot of help from the U.S. So are we seeing the end of the collective West as we know it?
It could be. The war in Ukraine has revealed some deep cracks in the West, and it doesn't seem like those cracks will heal anytime soon.
We're entering a time of major uncertainty, a time where things are shifting, where old alliances are being tested and new power dynamics are emerging. The things we used to be sure of are crumbling, and the future is more unpredictable than ever.
What strikes you the most as we try to understand all of this?
It's how fast everything is changing. It feels like we've gone through a decade's worth of global upheaval in just the past 3 years, and it seems like the pace is only picking up.
And we're feeling the impact everywhere. The war in Ukraine has triggered a whole chain reaction of consequences. Economic problems, energy crises, political instability, and renewed competition between major powers.
And all of this is happening while we're dealing with other huge global issues like climate change, technological advancements, and social divisions.
It's a lot to absorb, to be honest. But as always, understanding is key. The more we know about these complex forces, the better prepared we'll be to navigate the uncertain times ahead.
And that's why deep dives like this are so important. They help us take a step back from the daily news and get a deeper understanding of the underlying trends that are shaping our world.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. If the old world order is really falling apart, what's going to take its place? Will we see a world where power is spread out more evenly among different countries? Or will we see new groups forming, new spheres of influence, maybe even new kinds of conflict? These are the big questions we need to be thinking about.
They are the defining questions of our time. It's up to all of us to wrestle with these questions, to look for different perspectives, and to work towards a future that's fairer, more sustainable, and more peaceful. You know what gets me is like the psychological shift that's happening. For decades, the West was so sure they were in charge that they could make things happen on a global scale to, suit their own interests.
Yeah, that whole end of history thing, right? They thought they had the perfect system with liberal democracy and everyone else would just, naturally follow their lead.
Right, exactly. But the war in Ukraine, it's like that blew that whole idea out of the water. It showed how even the West's power has limits. Their alliances aren't as strong as they thought, and they were being way too cokey. You can practically sense the disillusionment setting in now.
It's everywhere you look. European leaders, Western experts, even the way the media talks about the conflict. It's like everyone's realizing the world isn't what they thought it was, that their influence is slipping and their old tricks just don't work anymore.
That's it, yeah. And it all comes back to that speech J.D. Vance gave at the Munich Security Conference. It wasn't just about Europe's policies. It was like he was directly attacking their entire way of thinking. He was basically saying, look, you guys don't get to claim the moral high ground anymore. Your whole image as the defenders of democracy and freedom, it's just not believable.
And the crazy thing is the way they reacted, all defensive and without offering any real solutions, it just made Vance's point even stronger.
Their anger only highlighted the weaknesses Vance was pointing out. It was like they were proving him right without even meaning to.
So where do we go from here? What happens now with the West? The transatlantic alliance, the whole global order?
Well, it's pretty obvious that the U.S. is changing direction. The Trump administration is sending clear signals that they're turning away from Europe and looking towards Asia-Pacific, where they see China as the bigger threat.
So Europe's on their own now. What does that even mean for NATO?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people think NATO is going to become irrelevant, just a leftover from a different time. Others say it'll have to adapt, maybe focus more on regional security threats. But the real issue is, can NATO actually work without the U.S., especially with how weak Europe's military is?
Yeah, the European NATO members haven't been spending enough on defense, and their militaries just aren't ready for a major fight without a lot of help from the U.S. So are we seeing the end of the collective West? Is that what's happening?
It's definitely possible. This war in Ukraine has exposed some deep divisions in the West, and it doesn't look like they'll be fixed anytime soon. We're moving into a time of huge uncertainty where things are shifting, old alliances are being tested, and new power structures are forming. The things we used to rely on are breaking down, and it's harder than ever to predict what the future holds.
What stands out to you most as we try to wrap our heads around all this change?
Honestly, it's just how incredibly fast it's all happening. It feels like we've gone through a decade's worth of global upheaval in just the past 3 years, and it's not slowing down, it's only getting faster.
And the effects are everywhere. The war in Ukraine has started this chain reaction of consequences, from economic problems and energy crises to political instability and major powers competing again.
And we're dealing with all this on top of other massive challenges like climate change, technological advancements, and social divisions. It's a lot to process.
It really is. But you're right, understanding is key. The more we know about all these forces at play, the better prepared we'll be for whatever comes next.
That's exactly why deep dives like this are so important. They give us a chance to take a break from the daily headlines and really get a grip on the underlying trends shaping our world.
So one last thing to think about as we finish this deep dive. If the old world order is truly falling apart, what's going to replace it? Will it be a world where power is more evenly distributed? Or will we see new blocks forming, new spheres of influence, maybe even new kinds of conflicts?
Those are the big questions we need to grapple with. It's up to all of us to think about these issues, to look for different perspectives, and to work towards building a future that's more just, more sustainable, and more peaceful.
And on that note, that's a wrap for our deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day,